Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7, back for 2024. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 684 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. We have headlines from Israel and Gaza. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we'll take a look at the rest of today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. A section of railroad near the city of Nizhny Tagil in Russia's Urals region was hit by a bang, TASS and RBC news agencies have reported. Baza, a Russian media outlet, said the blast on the railway took place near the station of San Donato near an oil depot. The Swedish Prime Minister announced that Sweden will send troops to Latvia next year as part of a Canadian-led force to deter Russia from attack, despite not yet being a full member of NATO. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, told a conference in Sweden via a video link, even Russia can be brought back within the framework of international law, its aggression can be defeated. Former UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has warned his successor Grant Shapps that the UK was at risk of falling behind in its military support for Ukraine because ministers had yet to announce a military aid budget for 2024-25. In the Russian-occupied Luhansk region in eastern Ukraine, a Russian warplane accidentally released a bomb on the town of Rubizhny. Leonid Pashechnik, the head of region's Moscow-appointed governor, said. Russia sent dozens of missiles across Ukraine early today, killing at least 4 civilians. Ukrainian authorities said 2 people were killed in the western Khelmensky region, and in Kryvyi, a 62-year-old was reported to have been killed. Elsewhere, the governor of Kharkiv region said a 63-year-old woman was killed in a strike on the town of Kharkiv. Ukrainian forces destroyed 18 out of 51 missiles launched during the wave of Russian airstrikes today, Ukraine's Air Force has said. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, said that Russia has left people homeless through its attacks on Ukraine. Russian shelling damaged homes and infrastructure in Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia and Khelnitsky regions. There are dead and injured, including children, she wrote on X. Pope Francis was quoted as saying in a speech referencing conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine that indiscriminately striking civilians is a war crime because it violates international humanitarian law. Russia evacuated about 300 residents of Belgorod, a city near the Ukrainian border, because of strikes by Kyiv, the governor of the region said. The Japanese foreign minister, Yoko Kamikaze, forced into a bomb shelter by an air alert in Kyiv yesterday, has pledged $37 million to support equipment, such as a drone detection system. She also announced donations of 5 mobile gas turbine generators and 7 transformers to help with power cuts caused by Russian attacks. And 5 children were among the 11 people killed by a Russian missile strike that hit in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk on Saturday, the governor of the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donetsk region has said. At least 23,084 Palestinians have been killed and 58,926 have been injured in Israeli strikes on Gaza since the 7th of October, according to the latest figures by the Gaza Health Ministry. The ministry said 249 Palestinians were killed and 510 were wounded in the previous 24 hours. Medics, patients and displaced people are fleeing from the main hospital in central Gaza as the fighting between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants draws closer, according to witnesses. The Israeli military has dropped leaflets designating areas surrounding the Al-Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Balah as a red zone, the International Rescue Committee has said. An employee at Al-Aqsa hospital said the facility has been struck multiple times in recent days. The World Health Organization, the WHO, said it had been compelled to cancel a mission to bring medical supplies to northern Gaza on Sunday after failing to receive security guarantees. That's the 4th time that WHO has had to call off a planned mission to bring urgently needed medical supplies to the Al-Auda hospital and the central drugstore in northern Gaza since the 26th of December, it said. Al Jazeera has accused Israel of a targeted killing after two of its Palestinian journalists in the Gaza Strip were killed in an Israeli strike on their car. Hamza Wal Dardu and Mustafa Turia were killed while they were on their way to carry out their duty for the channel in the Gaza Strip, the network said. The health ministry in Gaza also confirmed the deaths and blamed an Israeli airstrike. Pope Francis has said that indiscriminately striking civilians is a war crime because it violates international humanitarian law in his yearly address to diplomats. Commenting on the conflict between Israel and Hamas, Pope Francis called for a ceasefire on every front, including Lebanon. Israel has killed a senior military commander in Hezbollah's elite Radwan force, Wissam Hassan al-Tawil, in an airstrike on southern Lebanon around 6 kilometers from the border. It comes amid warnings from Lebanese security sources that the assassination could lead to a further escalation of the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Shia-armed movement. Israel is carrying out an unprecedented wave of deadly strikes in Syria, targeting cargo trucks, infrastructure, and people involved in Iran's weapons lifeline to its proxies in the region, sources have told Reuters. The sources said Israel had shifted strategies following the 7th October attack by Hamas fighters into Israeli territory and the ensuing Israeli bombing campaigns in Gaza and Lebanon. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Palestinians must not be pressed to leave Gaza at a press conference in Qatar. Blinken is on his fourth tour of the Middle East since the 7th October attacks by Hamas. He is due to head to Israel on Tuesday, where he said he would tell Israeli officials that it is imperative that they do more to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza. And UN experts have demanded accountability for sexual violence allegedly carried out by Hamas militants against Israeli civilians during the 7th of October attacks, saying that mounting evidence of rapes and genital mutilation point to possible crimes against humanity. Israeli authorities have opened an investigation into possible sexual crimes during the most deadly attack on Israel in its history. Now, we're lucky on the first Scotland at 7 of the new year to be joined by Maureen Watt. Maureen was a regional MSP for the North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011 and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021. Maureen is a former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen, good evening, a good new year to you. How are you keeping?
And a good new year to you, Andrew. Yes, I'm very well. Had a great festive season, but back to all plays and parages, say.
Absolutely, it's the same here, Maureen. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Now, before we get into the headlines, within the past couple of hours, it's been reported that the North East house builder Stuart Milne Group, SMG, has collapsed into administration, with the immediate loss of 217 jobs. Hundreds of other subcontractor jobs are also now at risk. SMG's bank rejected 2 offers for the business and then pulled the plug on funding. One of those offers is believed to have come from the firm's 73-year-old current owner and founder, Stuart Milne. He told the Press and Journal he was devastated by this totally unexpected outcome of the sale process. Mr. Milne also said he was struggling to accept it, given the profound impact it will have on employees, subcontractors, suppliers, and customers. The businesses are being wound down, and the administrators urged anyone with an interest in SMG's Scottish developments to get in touch. There was no further information on what the administration means exactly for those who may have invested large sums of money in homes that are yet to be built. So, Maureen, as an MP for parts of Aberdeenshire and a local person, what's your reaction to this breaking news from West Hill?
Yeah, it's very sad news, and I do accept that Stuart Mill himself will be devastated. He did care deeply about his employees, whatever else you might say about him. So I can understand that he is totally devastated. What's going on in the background, we don't really know, but it's important that the people who have lost their jobs get other ones quickly. I hope that it is the case that they will be picked up by other building contractors in the area and further afield, because of course Stuart Mill didn't just build houses in the northeast. He was building luxury developments, I understand it, in the central belt as well. So goodness knows what happened, whether the business model of just building high-end houses or concentrating on them was a good one or not, don't really know. But very devastating news this evening.
Thanks, Maureen. I mentioned that firstly because it's important breaking news, but secondly, we touch on economic policy and industrial policy a couple of times this evening, and so I thought it was useful to bring it up at the beginning because it is of relevance through some of the items we're going to talk about now. And we'll go to the first of those now, because in the first of a series of major economic speeches, Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf, MSP, speaking to an audience at Glasgow University, outlined his hopes that while the Brexit-based UK economy is failing people in Scotland, there is cause for optimism, pointing to Scotland's wealth of resources, established and emerging industries, and the economic success of comparable independent nations. The First Minister said that people across the UK are being let down by the Westminster-based parties who are not providing an alternative to UK economic decline. Mr Yousaf also made it clear that the ongoing UK cost of living crisis is evidence why the economic case for independence has never been more urgent, demonstrating that rejoining the European Union and encouraging inward migration would raise living standards in Scotland. The series of speeches will be evidence-based and designed to encourage an inclusive debate on a better way forward for Scotland's economy and society. The First Minister said there will be those who will never support independence. That doesn't mean those people should be dismissed, far from it. There is much to learn from an opposing perspective, and we can still all engage, even if to disagree, respectfully. It's my argument that independence is urgent. It's urgent precisely because of the cost of living is top of people's concerns. Because it is through independence, in particular the powerful combination of independence and EU membership, that we can raise living standards. I believe it is our duty as the Scottish Government, dedicated to working in the interests of the Scottish people, to set out an alternative path, one that leads to a renewed sense of possibility. Scotland has extraordinary resources such as renewable energy and key economic strengths such as our great universities. Our long-standing capabilities in renewables, advanced engineering, food and drink, life sciences, creative industries, and finance and business services are recognised the world over. He went on, and there is a further reason for optimism, the real-life shining example for Scotland that we can aspire to. Independent countries that are significantly fairer and wealthier than the UK. Countries like Ireland, Norway and Denmark have both higher productivity and lower inequality than the UK. In other words, they combine economic dynamism with social solidarity. So with all our strengths, the key question is, why not Scotland? So, Maureen, we have perhaps to refine the framing of this discussion a little bit. I think the First Minister was admitting that in some people would say that Scotland is an economic basket case in Northwest European terms. And I'm fairly sure that all of the countries that surround us look on the UK with some degree of pity. But Scotland is, after all, the richest part of the UK outside the southeast of England. So that would suggest to me that it's the UK that's the basket case, not Scotland. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think that the UK and the current Westminster government's running of it is increasingly becoming a basket case and increasingly looked on that by other countries and, more importantly, by investors. And clearly we're kind of lumped in with that in Scotland, although prior to COVID, I know that, as you said, that Scotland was the third biggest attractor of inward investment into the UK after London and the southeast. So the Scottish economy is not a basket case. The Scottish economy is underlyingly strong, and it is only, I think, because the current Scottish government and under the devolution settlement hasn't got the full range of economic powers, for example, macroeconomics, that we can start to realise the whole potential of Scotland and its people. And I haven't read all the speech. I've glanced through it, but one of the things that he said was that one of the think tanks had said that Scottish people could be 10,000. The average household would be £10,200 better off if we followed the type of economics of similar sized nations and had independence and were back in the EU. These are the kind of statistics that really must be highlighted by the SNP members themselves, and anyone who believes in independence between now and the next election, because it must be a return of a significant number of SNP MPs that can bring about independence and negotiations for independence.
Absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. And one thing that, to follow on from what you were just saying, in terms of the speeches and the statements that the First Minister has been making over the last few days, it struck me that he's starting 2024 fairly sprinting out of the blocks. Do you think that indicates maybe an evolution in campaigning style and maybe an evolution in the message?
Absolutely. I mean, we can't continue doing what we've done in the past. We have got an extremely hostile mainstream media to the SNP and the SNP government. On social media, it's equally, if not more, vile, and a concerted campaign by all the opposition parties to the SNP. So coming together, that provides a concerted storm against the SNP and independence at the moment. My view is that it's based on fear by all these groups that they can see from polling that they're doing themselves, probably, although we never see that the support for independence is strong and increasing, and that's why they're fighting for their own political lives now. But the SNP and all those who believe in independence must get out and renew our efforts to get up that figure over 55 to 60%, so that we can show that it is the settled will of the Scottish people that they want their country to be independent, and realise some of that potential that Hamza Yousaf was pointing out today.
Thanks, Maureen. Let's move on now, because Alex Sharma, the UK's former Business and Energy Secretary, who was president of the COP26 Glasgow Climate Summit in 2021, will not be voting for Rishi Sunak's oil and gas bill, criticising it as a sign the UK government was not serious about meeting its international climate commitments. The bill, which is being debated in Parliament today, would allow for an annual licensing regime for oil and gas exploration contracts. It has been hugely controversial among the Green wing of the Conservative Party. The former Minister, Chris Skidmore, announced on Friday he would be stepping down as an MP as a result of the proposed legislation. Sharma, the Conservative MP for Reading West, was heavily critical of the bill. He told BBC Radio 4's Today programme, "I will not be voting for this bill." He added, "What this bill does is reinforce that unfortunate perception about the UK rowing back from climate action." He said, "We saw this last autumn with the chopping and changing of some policies and actually not being serious about our international commitments. Just a few weeks ago at COP28, the UK government signed up to transition away from fossil fuels. This bill is actually about doubling down on new oil and gas licenses. It is actually the opposite of what we agreed to do internationally, so I won't be supporting it." UK ministers are not expecting a major rebellion tonight, although Zac Goldsmith, the Tory peer and former Environment Minister, urged Conservative MPs to follow Sharma's example and vote against the bill. The UK government has claimed that the bill will help energy security and contribute to bringing down energy bills, but Sharma said this was not the case. Last week, in a statement in response to a parliamentary question, it was revealed that, contrary to claims that the oil would be used in the UK government appeared to accept that the private companies extracting the oil would sell the vast majority internationally, saying it is not desirable to force private companies to allocate oil and gas produced in the North Sea for domestic use. So, Maureen, firstly, Sir Alex said that the legislation is a total distraction and a smoke and mirrors bill, which frankly changes nothing except to further damage the UK's international reputation on climate change. Is he right?
Yes, he's absolutely right. And clearly, he's learned a lot from being chair of COP in Glasgow and continuing his interest in that. And these are things that we in the SNP have been saying all along, that the reason for this bill tonight, and which sets out a system of having annual licenses for oil and gas exploration, is just about trying to increase the revenue from oil and gas, which will be sold, as he said, on the international market. Have anything to do, any help at all, with the oil and gas prices that customers are being charged at the moment. It's only to gain more revenue for the Treasury, presumably to make sure that there's monies that can be given for more tax breaks for the rich. But of course, we're talking about the annual giving out of license. These licenses have got to be bid for. Sometimes there may not be bidders for them. We don't know exactly how much oil and gas remains in the North Sea. It is a declining basin. So it is all just tying the hands, I think, of a government. I hope the Labour Party will vote against this bill tonight. I hope they have got the guts to say that it will be one of the first bills that they acts that they will repeal if elected into government after the general election. Watching it tonight will be really quite interesting, I think.
Thanks, Maureen. Now, as I also said, Sir Alec told the Today programme, what this bill does is reinforce that unfortunate perception about the UK rowing back from its climate action. We saw this last autumn with the chopping and changing of some policies and actually not being serious about meeting our international commitments. But it struck me that's the post-Brexit election year point, isn't it? International commitments don't matter to Westminster anymore, and the only thing that Westminster worries about is starting culture wars about low emission zones.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen that in terms of, did I read the other day about our commitment to the WHO in questioning? So yes, any international commitments are completely irrelevant to, as you say, this Tory government. They want to base the next general election on culture wars, exactly. And that is hugely damaging in the long term country. I mean, we know what happens when this is pursued long term in terms of wars. And I really worry. It really shocks supposedly educated people from Oxbridge mainly should even think about this. I mean, I just don't get it. I mean, do they really think the vast majority of voters in England that they're mainly concerned about are really up for this, when they're really concerned about their cost of living and how they're going to put food on the table and keep their homes warm and their kids warm, and that they can get the NHS when they need it? I just honestly don't understand it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. And we'll look next at the cost of living crisis from a particular perspective, because 3 energy companies have now been given permission to begin force-fitting prepayment meters in customers' homes again, if they adhere to strict new rules, ending a near year-long moratorium on the practice. EDF, Octopus and Scottish Power have been given the green light by the energy watchdog Ofgem to install prepayment meters under warrant, ending an industry-wide ban which was enforced amid an outcry over the impact on vulnerable customers. The 3 suppliers will have to meet a series of requirements before forcibly installing the meters, including making 10 attempts to contact a customer and providing £30 of credit. Firms have been told to refrain from installing the meters in the homes of vulnerable groups, including households with children under 2 and those who rely on continued power supply for medical equipment. All energy suppliers in the UK were prevented from forcibly installing the meters into customers' homes to recover debt after Ofgem belatedly stepped in to halt the practice last February. And that was after repeated warnings from campaign groups and MPs, and only after media reports that debt agents working for British Gas ignored signs of vulnerability to fit the meters. The remaining energy suppliers remain banned. Ofgem has yet to publish a separate report into the conduct of British Gas, which is owned by Centrica. Simon Francis, the coordinator of the End Fuel Poverty Coalition, said it was outrageous that energy firms are seeking to use the courts to force people onto prepayment meters in the middle of winter. He said, we still have grave concerns about the processes energy firms have in place for assessing vulnerabilities. So, Maureen, a couple of things here. Firstly, it was interesting to see that Octopus, one of the three companies that will now be permitted to install prepayment meters using warrants, Octopus has said it has no plans to restart involuntary installations of the prepayment meters. So, do you think, does that tell us something about the energy market, or about Octopus, or perhaps does it tell us something about EDF and Scottish Power?
Yes, I do wonder where this has come from. I mean, has it been lobbying by these three firms of the government to revoke this ban on installing prepayment meters, or what? It seems we haven't got all the information here. But it is absolutely awful. I mean, we've been campaigning, and people have been campaigning for years against prepayment meters. They're an absolute abomination. I mean, they require the cost of electricity for a prepayment meter is so much more than if you have a direct debit set up or whatever. Now, I do understand that some people want the control that prepayment meters give them, but it should be voluntary. And this way that these three companies have, who don't send their own employees in, they send in like hitmen to install these payment meters, which has been half the problem, is really bad. And you know, in what you were describing, Andrew, nowhere does it say something like company should work with the client and involve debt charities to see where the problem lies, that people can't pay their energy bills, something like that. You know, where's the corporate social responsibility in these companies? Is this not something that they could really make a big thing about, you know, showing that they have got some compassion and some, as I say, social responsibility, which is what very many companies are working towards in the future. So this seems to go against the grain on so many fronts.
Absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. Now, we'll come back to the economic situation in the UK for our next item, because Channel 4's chief executive, Alex Mann, has told its 1,200 staff that a round of major job cuts is looming as the broadcaster seeks to hasten its shift to streaming amid the worst TV advertising downturn in 15 years. In an internal email this morning, Ms. Mann said the broadcaster needed to accelerate plans to become a genuinely digital first public service broadcaster after the worst slump in traditional TV advertising since the financial crisis in 2008. Mann has referred to the advertising slump in 2023 as a market shock, while the ITV chief executive, Carolyn McCall, has said that the free-to-air broadcasting industry is facing the steepest downturn since 2008. Mann said that Channel 4 would unveil its strategic plans for the broadcaster's future from 2025 until the end of the decade at the end of January. In response to the 2008 crisis, Channel 4 cut almost a quarter of its staff, although at that time the broadcaster employed only 874 full-time employees. The cuts are understood to be focused mainly on London-based staff, given Channel 4 has a commitment to raise its number of employees in the nations and regions from 500 to 600 by 2025. The broadcaster's programming, commissioning and operations teams look likely to suffer the worst job cuts. About a quarter of Channel 4's $1.14 billion total revenues comes from digital advertising on its streaming service. In November, Alex Mann told the Commons Culture Committee that the state of the TV ad market was so bad it was in shock territory. She added that the broadcaster expected to make losses in each of the next 2 years after 3 years of surpluses. Channel 4 is also considering a request to tap a £75 million credit facility in meetings with officials from the Department for Culture, Media, Sport and the Treasury in the coming months, although it does have £253 million of cash held in reserve. So, Maureen, as I mentioned, Alex Mann told the workforce in an internal email this morning that given all the market change and complexity that we need to adapt to, there will be an impact on jobs at Channel 4. What a way to start the first working Monday of 2024.
Absolutely. Well, at least, it is a blow, but, how many companies before have been accused of making announcements like this before Christmas and spoiling everybody's Christmas? So I suppose that's one small consolation. But, I mean, Channel 4 is under so much pressure from this Tory government that, they hate Channel 4 and would do anything to see it off air, I'm sure. So I wonder how the discussions with the DCMS will go, but we know that the Tories hate Channel 4. If I do watch mainstream ordinary broadcasting, then it would be Channel 4 that I would go to for my news. But, younger generations do find their news on other outlets, and if they can speed up their online broadcasting presence, then I think that will probably be one way of trying to save jobs. But yes, it is a blow. And you say mostly London-based staff will go, but I think they do quite a lot of their broadcasting out of Leeds as well. So I hope that jobs there aren't under threat.
Thanks, Maureen. We'll move to economic and industrial policy in the EU now, because the EU has announced €4 billion of state aid investments in new factories producing electric batteries for cars, heat pumps and solar panels, as it seeks to accelerate production and uptake of green technologies and to combat cheap Chinese imports. The Swedish battery producer Northvolt will receive €902 million in state aid to build a new factory in Heide in Germany, while a wide range of clean tech factories in France are to get a €2.5 billion bump in state aid. The investments form part of the EU's mission to be climate neutral with net zero gas emissions by 2050, but are also designed to help insulate the bloc from the growing competition from Chinese car, solar panel, and other green tech factories. This follows the approval of similar schemes in Austria, Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia and Spain, worth in total €9.1 billion, with several others in the pipeline. The production of net zero equipment in Europe is of strategic importance and interest for the European economy and society. It has immense importance for achieving our goals in clean mobility, sustainability and competitiveness, said Margrethe Vestager, who is back in her role as the Executive Vice President of the Commission in charge of competition policy after her unsuccessful bid to head the European Investment Bank. The EU said the money going to Northvolt's gigafactory would enable it to produce battery cells in Europe instead of the US. This is the first state aid approved under a special scheme aimed to stop production facilities being lured overseas with the promise of greater foreign subsidies. Already, Europe is feeling the strain of the head start China has had on producing lower-cost electric cars. Last month, European leaders agreed to a 3-year suspension of a 10% tariff that was due to come in on EU electric cars exported to the UK and UK-manufactured electric cars exported to the EU. So, Maureen, these investments, as I say, form part of the EU's mission to be climate neutral with net zero gas emissions by 2050, but are also designed to help insulate the bloc from the growing competition from Chinese green tech factories and manufacturers. It struck me this close connection between this divergence, both in terms of green policy and industrial policy between the EU and the UK, it struck me as that perhaps that divergence is beginning to widen.
Well, I've just written down here in my notes, that we were still in the EU because isn't there a factory in the Highlands, is it Caithness, who were going to be making batteries that were really struggling for this
Yep.
kind of investment, and the Nissan and Sunderland, I think, could have qualified for this kind of investment had we still been in the EU. And it just shows you how, and they haven't been able to make these kind of investments because they haven't had the backing of the Westminster government. So it is an example, as you say, Andrew, of the UK and the EU diverging, and well, maybe the UK and the rest of the world diverging, because it seems that the world and his wife see the need to move towards green technologies. But yet we've been talking about today the UK Parliament discussing a bill to give out new oil and gas licenses. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you, as the saying goes?
No, that's absolutely right. And I think you're talking about AMTE, who have a factory in Caithness and were proposing
Yeah.
to build a factory in Dundee, but I don't think that's going ahead now. There was one other aspect I wanted to touch on with you about the story, Maureen. The Chinese conglomerate Build Your Dream, BYD, launched lower cost electric cars into the EU market last summer, and it recently became the world's #1 producer of hybrid and battery only vehicles. So, do you think is the EU bolting the garage door, so to speak, after the Chinese electric car has already sped off?
Well, I'm not sure. Well, maybe, but I was discussing this with a salesman, and when I was had my car in for a service the other week, and I hadn't realised that 20% of new cars now are electric cars. So, although you wouldn't get it from the Westminster government, there's clearly a demand for them in the UK, and the Chinese, very resourceful, are obviously trying to fill that gap, and others are maybe catching up. But I think brand loyalty has got quite a lot to do with buying a car, hasn't it? So we'll see. But clearly, again, the UK is falling behind in all of this, and it's so sad because car manufacturers have made the commitment to move to green energy, and yet, a few months ago, wasn't it, that Sunak rolled back on meeting our commitments and targets, the date of that, which kind of upset the market and upset these companies' plans. And they plan for such a long term that, what we were talking about earlier, Andrew, it's little wonder that companies don't want to invest in the UK, because you don't really know of market conditions you're investing in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Maureen. We'll move to more international news now, because Bangladesh's Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, has won office for a 5th term in an election that was overshadowed by a ruthless crackdown on the opposition and low voter turnout. The Election Commission announced in the early hours this morning that Hasina's ruling Awami League had won a 4th consecutive term, winning almost 75% of the seats. This will be her 5th term as Prime Minister, as she previously ruled between 1996 and 2001, before coming back to power in 2009. Hassani's Awami League candidates faced almost no effective rivals after the opposition Bangladesh Nationalist Party boycotted Sunday's vote and called a general strike, describing it as a sham election. In the months leading up to the election, tens of thousands of Bangladesh Nationalist Party BNP leaders and rank-and-file members had been arrested en masse and kept in terrible conditions in overcrowded prisons, while opposition protests were met with heavy police violence. At least 9 BNP leaders and supporters have died in jail in the past 3 months, according to the opposition. As she cast her vote yesterday, Hasina, 76, had insisted that the election was free, fair and neutral, and she tried to play down the opposition boycott, calling the BNP a terrorist organisation. Hasina has presided over breakneck economic growth and a booming garment export industry in the country of 170 million people once beset by grinding poverty. But her government has been accused of human rights by human rights groups and political opponents of rampant human rights abuses and pushing the country towards authoritarian one-party rule. The BNP had called for the election to be held under a caretaker government to ensure it was not rigged. As the results were announced, BNP leaders came out in unison to condemn the polls. Voting at several polling centres was also halted due to allegations of election fraud, conflict and forced ballot stuffing, the same alleged irregularities and rigging that marred the two previous elections that brought Hasina to power. Tariq Rahman, the BNP chairman who lives in exile in London due to corruption allegations against him that he says are politically motivated, he said what unfolded was not an election, but rather a disgrace to the democratic aspirations of Bangladesh. The crackdown on the opposition and the alleged foregone nature of the polls appeared to have a significant impact on voter turnout. As the polls closed at 4 p.m, the Chief Election Commissioner, Qazi Habibul Awal, stated that the voter turnout was about 28%. However, this figure was promptly revised during the briefing by other officials who corrected it to about 40%. But that's half the turnout of the previous election in 2018. So, Maureen, Hasina has, as I said, Sheikh Hasina has presided over breakneck economic growth and a booming garment export industry, but the government has been accused of rampant human rights abuses and pushing the country towards authoritarian one-party rule. And it struck me that sounds a little bit like the same formula in Brazil and what we might be about to begin seeing in Argentina as well.
Yes, yes. And I think in almost every case it is right-wing authoritarian rule, isn't it? And that is very worrying that it's happening, in various parts of the world. And, hats off to Broadcasting Scotland for bringing this to the attention of people in Scotland tonight, because I haven't heard much about it in other broadcasting outlets. But yes, it is worrying. There used to be quite a lot of monitoring of elections in other countries by election monitors from throughout the rest of the world, and you don't hear that happening so much now. And I just wonder if countries can get away with holding elections without having monitoring from outside. But it just shows you if people are given jobs, even although not well paid and in very harsh conditions, then perhaps these rulers can get away with it. And I think what we can do in the West, other than political influence, or in other countries, not just the West, is make sure that we're buying garments that are ethically sourced and that are using fibres which aren't polluting our atmosphere and our rivers and all the rest. So I think we can all have an influence here rather than buying necessarily loads of cheap clothes that perhaps, as I say, looking to see where our clothes are sourced.
That's a very good point, Maureen. Thank you. We'll come back to Scotland now for our next item, because as many people return to their jobs following the festive break, the Scottish Government has reminded those in part-time and full-time work that they can qualify for Scottish Government benefits. People in work can receive many of the payments administered by Social Security Scotland, including those designed to help low-income families. The Scottish Government also delivers Job Start Payment, a one-off payment to help young people who haven't been working to meet the cost of starting a new job. In Scotland, around 1 in 3 people getting universal credit are in work, and universal credit is the qualifying benefit for several other payments. Thousands of working people get Scottish Child Payment and the other benefits which make up Social Security Scotland's 5 family payments. These consist of 3 Best Start grants for pregnancy and baby payment, early learning payment, and school age payment, and Best Start foods. People with jobs can also qualify for adult disability payment with qualification not based on employment or income, and one-off payments including the winter health heating payment and funeral support payment. The Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley-Ann Somerville, said, "In January, there are lots of people starting new jobs or returning to work for the first time in a while, and I'd urge them to check what benefits they may be eligible for. I'd particularly highlight the support available to young people starting work via Job Start Payment. This one-off payment can make a difference with the costs of getting up and running in a new job, and again, we want to make sure it reaches as many eligible people as possible. We are helping people across Scotland through the cost of living crisis by committing £6.1 billion in social security benefits and payments. That's £1.1 billion more than the block grant adjustment received due to spend on comparable benefits by the UK government." So, Maureen, does that £1.1 billion difference, that £1.1 billion more than the block grant adjustment, does that demonstrate the divergence between the political priorities in Westminster and the political priorities in Holyrood?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we talked earlier about Hamza Yousaf's speech today, and he demonstrated how differently we would in an independent Scotland. While Rishi Sunak thinks that tax cuts for the richer people will boost the economy, he doesn't think about those that are on the breadline who are wondering, as we talked about earlier, where the food is going to come from and where their heating costs for heating are coming. And if you're worried about that, are you telling me that you're going to be as productive at your work as you possibly can be? That you're going to be concentrating on your work? Or are you going to be worrying about, as I say, all the things that you've got to think about, the bills that are coming in? So it does show the complete divergence. And I've talked before about how the countries where the gap between the poor is narrower are healthier, wealthier overall, and more sustainable economies. And that's not just me talking, loads of economists believe that too. See it demonstrated, as we've said before, in our Scandinavian neighbours and Ireland, where GDP is gross domestic product per head is so much higher than Scotland. And all my life, the UK used to say that Ireland was an economic basket case because it had its independence. So these are messages that really must be broadcast widely across Scotland to encourage more people to see that independence is the only way forward for Scotland to be better off.
Thanks, Maureen. And I was going to ask you as well, as I mentioned, in Scotland, around 1 in 3 of people who receive universal credit are actually in work. And I wonder, does that indicate that there's a problem with economic or industrial policy at a UK level, and perhaps that 14 years of Tory austerity has in fact delivered a low-wage, low-skill, low-job security economy?
Absolutely. And I think another thing that Hamza Yousaf said in his speech today, and I will stand corrected if I'm wrong, that it'll take to something like 2028 to reach the living standards that we had in 2008. I mean, come on. We're supposed to be a rich industrial nation, and our people are worse off now than they were in 2008. Now, I know we've had COVID. That wasn't self-inflicted, but Brexit was self-inflicted. That has caused huge damage. And, I think that the living wage is going up to £11 an hour, but it should be something like 15. And I always say to folk who object to that, well, actually, you're subsidising poor payers poor employers, not poor employers,
Yeah.
but employers who are paying poor wages out of your taxation, because people have got to get these benefits to lift them out of poverty. So there are huge things that we could do if we had the full control of economic powers in Scotland. And I think, everybody's got to realise that we cannot continue to go on the route we're going, because it is a downward spiral.
Thanks, Maureen. And we'll come to our final item now, because the findings of an internal audit review into the use of Scottish Government electronic purchase cards, EPCs, has been published. Electronic purchase cards are routinely used by the Scottish and UK governments to pay for low-value items such as catering, one-off supplies and training. The internal audit team reviewed 194 transactions that had been the focus of reporting or commentary in news and social media. The audit of the sample found that all but one were appropriate expenditure under the current EPC policy. The transaction that was not appropriate was not made by the cardholder and was identified via the banking system controls as fraudulent, and the expenditure was refunded. The review was commissioned by the First Minister following the public release of significant amounts of EPC spending data in August last year. The review was undertaken by auditors in the Scottish Government Directorate for Internal Audit and Assurance, who have recommended improvements to policy and guidance. An ongoing review of the number of cardholders has already resulted in a reduction of just under 10% since the summer, while mandatory training and follow-up refresher training will also be given to everyone with EPC responsibilities. The Public Finance Minister, Tom Arthur, said, "It is reassuring that the review concludes that the transactions audited were all appropriate under the current EPC policy, with the only exception being a fraudulent transaction carried out by a third party. I welcome the recommendations which aim to strengthen processes, including reviewing what may or may not be purchased through EPC, as well as improved monitoring and mandatory training." So, Maureen, given that we are as we've been discussing this evening, we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. This sounds like a sensible and timely review and audit, given the cost of living crisis.
Yes, and isn't it a surprise that everything really was legit, and actually that Nicola Sturgeon wasn't buying nail varnish for herself through these things, as you would have thought had happened from the way that some of the mainstream media covered this story. But it's good that things are, this shows to me that there is a tight control on budget expenditure, and there should be a tight control on budget spending, and internal auditors are doing their job. And of course, there is an audit committee in the Parliament which scrutinises closely government expenditure. So it's unfortunate that the mud that was thrown wasn't correct, but the mud presumably will stick, and the way that this story will be covered by the mainstream media, particularly outlets like the Daily Mail, will be interesting today. No doubt they'll find a way of showing that SNP government bad.
Well, that's a very good point that you make, Maureen. And the Scottish Government has listed today a few examples of the kind of things which no doubt Stephen Kerr, MSP, and Lord George Fawkes would be tweeting excitedly about, but which expenses were in fact legitimate. You mentioned nail polish there, and that, of course, was being used by Science and Advice for Scottish Agriculture to distinguish items of glassware to prevent cross-contamination. Nail polish has to be used for this because of the chemistry standard operating procedures. The purchase of pregnancy tests, which must be included as part of a ship's medical stores for Marine Scotland vessels under merchant shipping legislation, and ASDA Christmas purchases, which was actually a Christmas lunch for Marine Scotland vessel crew working on Christmas Day. So these were proper and necessary legitimate expenses, but would no doubt generate heat in the minds of unionist politicians and their client media. Do you think, is that taken in the round? Is that an indication that we really need a rather more grown-up politics?
Yeah, well, absolutely. We certainly need a better standard of journalism in the whole of the UK, not just looking for a headline, and also not all deciding in a wee huddle like they do in the Scottish Parliament what their story is going to be today and what their angle on it is going to be today. And when I challenged a couple of journalists on this, they had no answer for me a few months ago. So, but we get maybe we get the journalism that we expect and we pay for. But is that really an answer? I don't think so. I just wish journalists themselves had a bit more morality among themselves. But then it's a journalism is a profession still very much dominated by men, isn't it? So maybe we need more women and more diversity in there to see if we could get a better standard of journalism.
Let in a little bit of fresh air, perhaps. Absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. That's some great perspective, especially from Holyrood. But I'm afraid that that's all that we've got time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes and to continue to develop the station, making new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We now urgently need to raise at least £10,000 to pay our bills within the next 7 days. We have already raised almost £2,000 thanks to the generosity of our supporters. However, we do need to raise the remaining £8,000 immediately if we are to be able to pay our bills and to continue making programmes. Please donate whatever you can afford. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on X-Twitter, Mastodon and Blue Sky at Broadcast Scot. Please like, retweet, boost and reskeet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. I'd like to say thank you to I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening. And of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest this evening, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. Hope our viewers did.
Thanks for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Please, everyone, look after yourselves and please have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.